There we go. So, hello, welcome and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second instalment of the Institute for Northern Studies Winter 2021 seminar series. My name is Dr. Andrew Lind, and I have the great pleasure of chairing these sessions. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I've just got a couple of very boring housekeeping points that I need to rattle through quickly. Firstly, just to make everyone aware that tonight's session is being recorded. And secondly, if you have any questions at any point during the paper tonight, please feel free to post them via the chat function. So don't use the Q&A function. If you could just put everything into the chat and we can pick them out, and make sure that you put all your questions to all panelists rather than to everyone. Now, to the reason that everyone is here this evening, it is my great privilege to introduce my good friend, Professor Steve Murdoch, to the Institute this evening. Steve is genuinely one of the few Scottish historians who really doesn't need much of an introduction, but it'll be rude not to, so I might as well give it a go. Steve is a visiting professor here at the Institute for Northern Studies and is known internationally for his work on early modern Northern Europe, especially his research on Scotland and Scandinavia. He's the author of near countless research papers and chapters, and he puts the rest of us to shame in that department. But he's perhaps best known for his books Britain, Denmark, Norway and the House of Stuart, 1603 to 1660, and Network North, Scottish Kin, Commercial and Covert Associations in Northern Europe, 1603 to 1746. Now, tonight Steve's going to be returning to some of the themes of those works in his paper, War and Peace, Scotland and Norway as Friends and Foes, 1589 to 1713. And I'll hand over to Steve. Welcome.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Well, thank you, Andrew, for the introduction and for inviting me along tonight. This paper is something that I've returned to several times over the last 20 odd years, and it's now that I've had a chance to reflect on a lot of the stuff that I put into my monograph that Andrew mentioned earlier on. I get a chance to actually think about what is the relationship between Scotland and Norway, and what are the things that are often missing from that relationship in the way that they're presented in books. Now, certainly, Andrew, can you get the control? How do you? There you go. That's got it. The history, or at least the civilian history, of relations between Scotland and Norway are well known to anybody who works in the trans-North Sea world. The main focus of these books is civilian in dimension. It's very often centred on the timber trade, and different scholars from different parts of Norway tend to look at the world differently. There's either a trade round about Stavanger, which is what Arnold Lillehammer looked at, or there's the Scotto-Norwegian på Sunnhordland, which is what Ness looked at. General works like Alexander Bugge's work on Scottish trade in the 1600s. And Sylvie Søgner's chapter was quite interesting because it's one of the few that actually points out that there is no, this concept of the Scottish-Norwegian timber trade is only part of the story, that in fact you can look at the same story from a Dutch-Norwegian perspective, which takes Scotland out of the equation, the Dutch tending to work the timber trade further north in Norway than the Scots, at least for part of the period. I think some of the advances that have been made recently are not more interesting, but certainly nuance the work of the earlier generation of Norwegian scholars. And I want to draw your attention particularly to the work of Anne Crone and Corrali Mills. Rather than the timber trade, as in the sailing of timber back and forth between Scotland, they're actually looking at timber usage within Scotland and doing marvellous work on dendrochronology of a series of buildings across Scotland. They have literally got dozens of articles out there which are well worth a read if you don't already know them. For my own part, trying to map the diaspora, the Scottish diaspora in Norway, was only one part of my PhD way back in the day, where I was looking at Scottish relations generally with Denmark, Norway, or the House of Oldenburg. To do that, Alexia Grosjean and myself, and now with a suite of editors, have built a database where we've tried to actually house those people who actually migrated to Scandinavia. Where did they settle? And this is important for trying to put Norway in context in the larger Scandinavian and Baltic world, and its place to Scotland and indeed England. So what did we put into the database and what were we trying to achieve with it? Tried to map out army and navy officers. We put in clergymen and chaplains, we put in diplomats and agents, merchants and traders, nobles and social elite, and by that I mean people who actually went to Scandinavia, became ennobled, as well as people leaving Scotland who were already noble, and students and academics. And the reason we selected these people was we wanted to look at settled merchants. We didn't want to just look at a ship coming in from the port of Aberdeen, arriving in Bergen and leaving again. It's actually a database of migration and settlement rather than a database of everybody who set foot in Scandinavia. You notice at the top here we say army and naval officers. We didn't do common soldiers because that would have involved databasing 75,000 private soldiers, and that was a little bit much in a 3-year period. We've tried to break down and map the database in several different ways. We've done it here by nation for you, just so you can see who's in there. We were told when we started doing our various PhDs, I did Denmark, Norway, Alexia Grosjean did Sweden and Finland, and we were told that the Scots would be a tiny minority compared to the English in particular. And yet, every record base we went to, we systematically tried to tag in everybody from each of the nations where they identified themselves, some of it speculative, and the results of that were quite astonishing. The overwhelming majority of migrants going out from Scotland between 1580 to about 1707 are Scots. About 1,200 are English, about 128 are Irish, and 28 are Welsh. Now, with the Irish and with the Welsh, I would put in the caveat that many Irishmen are actually Scots-Irish and coming in with, we only call them Irish if they identify themselves as such. The Welsh seldom identify themselves as Welsh in this period. When they do, they often use the curious name Welsh Englishman. The other thing about this data set is you'll notice that we have got a lot of women in there who weren't in our categories as we were putting them in. But when we went through the church records, we were finding them. So we've got 290 Scottish women, 32 English women, 12 Irish women, and only one woman we can definitively say is Welsh. And that's a problem, of course. What is the problem with women in this database? Simple fact is they haven't left us the same record. So we can even go to church records where there's a marriage, and we can find out that merchant John Abernethy has in fact married a woman, and that's all it says about them in the church records. However, we do get a few that we can find, and we're trying to build up those biographies consistently now, particularly myself and a colleague from UHI, Katrin Zickerman. So what we get is tantalizing little glimpses. This is from Elsinore, the church in Elsinore. We find Sarah Clark from Scotland, who was born in Scotland in 1568 and died in 1652, coming from a wonderful place we've all heard of called Edinburgh. But that's actually all we know about her. When you go through the Elsinore record base, you can't actually find Sarah in there. So this is a problem we've encountered. So there are very few Scottish women in the database. We also get people like Metamaria Dunbar. Now, I know exactly who her father is. She's the daughter of Patrick Dunbar. She signs this copy of her Bible. But what do we actually know about her? And the answer to that is very little, because genealogies about about Dunbar's family, miss her out altogether. She's not important. We're trying to change it. So what of the women that we do know something about that will impact on Scottish-Norwegian relations? Well, of course, the first one is Margaret of Denmark, sometimes known as Margaret of Norway. When she married James III of Scotland in 1469, there was a certain unity coming together, a relationship between Scotland and Norway, or Scotland and Denmark, Norway, or in this case, it was Scotland and the Kalmar Union at this point. Of course, Because of the dowry clause in that wedding, and I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on that, Orkney and Shetland are pawned to Scotland as part of the dowry. And this is a contentious issue that's going to come through throughout the period, at least until the 1640s. I've got the date 1642 there. Some of you will know why already. The relationship gets even closer between the House of Stuart and the House of Oldenburg when King James marries Anna of Denmark in 1589 in Norway. Marries her by proxy in Bergen, travels to Norway to collect her, and then goes down and marries her again in person in Elsinore. It's at this period that we think that the Stuart and Oldenburg states should be coming together, and that we would find more contact between Scotland and Denmark-Norway than we would against that renegade province called Sweden. Yet, strangely, that's not how it works out for us at all. Going through the database numbers, you'll see that there's a huge discrepancy in the migration. This is after 1589, bear in mind, that more people settle in Sweden, including Finland and Ingria, than do in Denmark-Norway. A staggering 3,663 people settle in the Swedish realms, only 1,500 settle in the Danish-Norwegian realms, of which 466 settle within Norway. How does that break down by city? Well, if you look at Åbo, Turku, we have 118. Gothenburg, which many people say or would think is the biggest of the ports, only 174. Danzig, surprisingly, and the big Baltic grain trade, only 222. It actually comes down to two centres. Stockholm, 375, Bergen, 351, settled people in a 100-year period that we know of. Since this is about Scotland and Norway, and since we're going to look at conflict and conflict resolution, we have to mention the work of Nina Osby Pedersen. Unfortunately, Nina is a very shy individual. She was hoping to come along tonight. She published this article and her master's thesis, and that's the only work that she did. But the master's thesis in particular is the encyclopedia of Scottish immigration into Bergen in particular, but Norway in general in the 17th century. From this, we get a good background as to the type of people who are moving into Norway, what kind of roles they fulfill. We also get our first hint of the built heritage that the Scots impact into Norway. Surprisingly, it's not that great. There are only two real buildings that you can attribute to Scots there. There is a Scottish quarter right opposite the Hansa quarter in Bergen. If you look up the hill, that's the Scots quarter. You'll still see Scottish street names there. But actually, in terms of built heritage, there's only the Rosencrantz Tower in Bergen itself, the tower being built by, or rather refined by Scottish stonemasons in the late 1500s. And of course, we've got Barony Rosendal in the Hardanger Fjord, and that was built by the Mowat family. And these two buildings are unusual in being the types of stone castles that you get, and Barony Rosendal is only one of two baronies in Norway, if my memory serves me correct. But since we've now identified Bergen as the big centre in the whole of the Danish-Norwegian state, how does it compare, and what kind of roles do people undertake? In Bergen, there's 233 merchant burgesses out of 351 settled people we can identify. In Stockholm, there's far fewer burgesses out of a larger population. But if you look at the roles that they do, there are more city councillors, there's more new nobility, there's more people, Scots, serving in the Swedish Riksdag, there's more councillors of the realm, and there's other people sitting in state councils, such as the College of War and the College of Commerce. So what is this? What are we seeing from this data? Well, actually, what we're seeing is the difference between a commercial relationship between Scotland and Norway and a conflict-driven or military relationship between Scotland and Sweden. We'd think it would all be good. Scotland and Denmark, Norway are in alliance. They've been in alliance since 1469, and then Scotland goes into an alliance of sorts with England in 1603. And actually, the Union of Crowns in 1603 starts to bring conflict into the area of Scottish relations with Denmark, Norway. Why is that? Doesn't seem to make sense. The problem there is to do with English whaling. So because the English claim the islands of Greenland and Svalbard for their whaling rights, or at least they want the whaling rights there, and the Danes and Norwegians claim the same, there's a friction, and that starts to involve Scots. Scottish ships are seized after 1603. Christian IV makes very little distinction if he sees a Scottish ship or an English ship. If he thinks that he's being outdone for taxes or whatever to do with the Greenland whaling, the Scots are getting taken in as part of that. However, since 1589, many Scots have already taken service in Denmark. One of those is a man from Fife called Captain John Cunningham. And it is John Cunningham who leads what's called the Voyages of Reclamation in 1605 and 1606, where he leads fleets of Danish Norwegian ships across to Greenland, where he plants the Dannebrog, the Danish flag, and reclaims them for the Oldenburg state. He actually takes the liberty of naming somewhere after himself as well, Cunningham's Mount, while he's there, which is recorded in John Caithness's account of the Northwest Passage in 1612. There's also another problem. What do we mean by Greenland? If you look at the map on the right, you're actually looking at a map of Svalbard, which the English call Greenland. But if you look at the map on the left, which is called Spitsbergen, you can see that Spitsbergen is a tiny little part in the middle, and Greenland is the ice sheet along the coast. So actually, there's a lot of conflicts that happen in this period between the English and the Danish, which are to do with a misunderstanding of what people mean by the term Greenland. So that this obviously comes into play when it comes to Scottish-Norwegian relations, which I'll explain more of in a moment. Along with John Cunningham, we get an influx of people. Andrew Mowat coming in from Shetland, Axel Mowat, his son, David Balfour, shipbuilder, Sir James Clerk, another shipbuilder. They're moving to Norway and building warships by which the Danes and Norwegians can see off the threat of the English in Greenland or Svalbard, depending how you count it. Cunningham is one that you should really pay attention to here. He becomes the lensman or the governor of Finnmark between 1619 and 1651, and it's considered his own fiefdom. He moves in a whole set of Scottish families up there, and in the cause of Danish-Norwegian imperialism, he is pretty brutal to the Sami in the region, but he's also quite harsh on Norwegians, on Russians and Swedes, or anybody else who's going to try and claim Finnmark, because this is a contested zone. And the reason that he's so strong as a governor is because he's a foreigner. He doesn't have any allies in the area that he needs to bow down to, or that he can be bought off from. And he's also a pretty cruel human being, conducting one of the largest witch hunts in Danish-Norwegian history. We'll come back to Cunningham later on. But now I want to move it to Sweden. And why would I move a talk about Scotland and Norway to Sweden? And that's because we shouldn't think that there is just this special dynamic between the Scots and the Norwegians. And the main character that's going to come into the first of our major conflicts here is Sir James Spence of Wormiston, also of Öreholm in Sweden. He's the general of all British troops in Swedish service between 1609 and 1632. He's as much the Stuart ambassador to Stockholm as he is the Vasa ambassador to London. He's also Oxenstierna's most accomplished spy master. And it's because of Sir James Spence of Orholm that we come to the first and perhaps the most famous of the conflicts between the Scots and the Norwegians, and that is Scotto-Tog, or the Cunningham massacre of 1612. One of the reasons that Spence is doing what he's doing is that James VI is working a duplicitous plan where he's allowing the Swedes to gain military strength because he doesn't want Christian IV to overrun Sweden again. He actually likes there being two different Scandinavian power bases. So in order to do that, he allows Spence to secretly recruit Scots and send them across Norway and into Sweden. At the same time, under Lord Willoughby, he sends 6,000 English troops to Denmark as part of his agreement with Christian IV, his brother-in-law, that he will defend and honour the 1589 alliance. 300 Scots raised in Caithness and Orkney are killed in Cunningham as they cross through Norway in 1612. This becomes the theme of Edward Storm's Sinklars Vise, which is famous. When you walk into the National Museum of Norway in Oslo, you're confronted by a wall-sized glass panel with this poem on it. It goes on for many more verses than I'm telling you here. Of the 300 Scots, 180 are killed in battle on the day. The rest are massacred the day after the battle. There's about 15 officers are taken hostage and have to go down to Copenhagen. The Norwegians who killed these get a song. They get a song about this event. But what doesn't get a song is what happens next. The Earl of Orkney is furious, as is the Earl of Caithness, that their men have been massacred. Privateering raids followed, resulting in several Norwegian towns getting shipping losses, and they are led by one Simon Stewart, an Orcadian, who we will return to later in the next war. 2,500 Scots thereafter crossed Norway into Sweden. This is Spence's main levy, and they didn't get a song either. They've briefly sieged Trondheim, and they walked through and joined the rest of the Scottish troops that were there, and then came down to the border near Kalmar. James Spence's stepbrother, Robert Anstruther, held an equivalent position, except not in the army, but as a diplomat. He is Christian IV's diplomat to London, and he's London's diplomat to Copenhagen. And he writes this cracking letter where he says, "Honourable brother, if this matter is not speedily looked into, it'll breed a great inconvenience between England and Scotland. And if there's a day of battle, then the English and Scots will cut one another's throats. There's passed some messages already between some of the nations. We can imagine that kind of provocation getting fired across the border. But the main role of these two ambassadors was not to allow this to happen. They had to stop it, and they had to get Christian IV to come to terms with the young prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden. When you look at their correspondence from 1612, you can see that there's an exchange of letters. They're not just writing to each other. They're actually including their dispatches from the kings they represent, so that James Spence gets the letters of Christian IV and Robert Anstruther gets the letters of Gustav Adolf. So these stepbrothers from Fife are actually manipulating the diplomatic process, trying to stop that conflict from coming to a head. And they succeed. At the Treaty of Cnered in 1613, the peace celebrated as being a victory for King James of Great Britain between Christian IV and Gustav Adolf is negotiated by James Spence for Sweden and Sir Robert Anstruther from Denmark, Norway. What did Scotto-Tog actually do in terms of harming or otherwise relations between Scotland and Norway? And the answer to that is absolutely nothing. 8 new Scots were admitted burgesses in Bergen in 1612 to 1613. 56 Scottish ships traded timber in Sunnhordland, the area around Bergen. And 70 ships, Scots and Norwegian, traded in Rufluke, the area around Stavanger. So Scotto-Tog, which is often hailed as the big thing that happened between Scotland and Norway in 1612, actually overshadows a much larger commercial exchange in which the populations go on with the business of trade regardless. If they thought that there was going to be peace, they were wrong. Partly, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about the 30 Years' War, but there is a war that breaks out 1619, although most people say 1618, where Frederick V of the Palatinate and Elizabeth of Bohemia take the throne of Bohemia, now modern-day Czech Republic. Why has this got anything to do with Scotland and Denmark, Norway? Elizabeth of Bohemia is born in Dunfermline in Fife. She's half Danish. Her uncle wants to get involved in the war to try get her restored to her thrones. 13,700 Scots joined the Danish-Norwegian army, and 6,000 English also served Christian IV. The Scots, of course, being stroppy, refused to fight under the Danish flag because they want to demonstrate they're not mercenaries. They're doing this out of dynastic loyalty to Elizabeth of Bohemia. But this huge influx has consequences for a war that's going to take place about 20 years later. There are some immediate impacts. Some 12,000 out of the 13,500 Scots who served in Denmark were killed or wounded. 12,000, according to William Lithgow, of the 13,500 levy don't come home. Some of these go into Swedish service, and that maybe accounts for the size of the number reported. But if we think that the Scots going into Swedish service was Danish service was large, the Scots going into Swedish service was much, much more significant. If there was 2 Scottish generals in Danish-Norwegian service, there were 15 in Swedish service. 13,700 troops in Danish-Norwegian service. 30,000 Scots served the Swedes between 1628 and 1648. Why did they serve? We mentioned it before, dynastic loyalty, but also you'll see here next to dynastic loyalty, next to the defense of Elizabeth, is for the liberty of our distressed brethren in Christ. Robert Monroe wrote that in 1637, and by 1638, something else was happening in Scotland that distressed the Protestant brethren in Christ of the British Isles, and that was the signing of the National Covenant. And this has implications for Scottish, Danish, in fact, Stuart-Oldenburg relations. When the covenant was signed, Charles I was up against it. It looked like he was going to be overwhelmed. He asks his uncle, Christian, for support. And Christian, despite being obliged by treaty of 1589 and 1639 not to speak about it, naturally asks for Orkney and Shetland back. He wants them back in pawn. Charles I refuses, but by 1641, Danish ambassadors in London have worked out that Orkney and Shetland don't actually return that much revenue. And Christian changes his tune, and he wants to swap the pawn deal for Newcastle. He says any English city to begin with, as something that will actually give him revenue, and in return for revenue, he'll send troops across to Britain. And so on 22nd of October 1642, Christian IV writes to court at Ulsfeld and says, I've done it, I have Newcastle in pawn. We'll return to that in a moment, because Christian has got more pressing concerns. In 1643, the Swedish general Lennart Torstensson invaded Denmark from the south. Now, whether this was just out of some gratuitous strike, as some people say, whether it's because they believed that Christian IV was going to join the empire and fight Sweden, who were ensconced in Germany in the war, the jury is still out. But what we do know is that this caused problems for Scots in Norway and Scots in Sweden. What we actually find is that taking place in Norway and in Sweden, there's a proxy war. And it's called, the war itself is Handelskrig. That's the Norwegian part of the Torstensson, the larger Torstensson invasion. Handelskrig is the attempt struck from Norway to try to attack Gothenburg and knock Gothenburg out, to try to relieve pressure on Copenhagen and Jutland in particular. No less than 6 regiments of the Scottish army, of the Norwegian army in Hannibal's Krieg, are commanded by Scots. These are a mix of some, like Andrew Seaton in Bohus, who is a remnant soldier from the 1620s, but most of the rest of these colonels are actually coming in. They're royalist refugees coming out of the British Civil Wars, taking on Norwegian regiments. And they're joined, of course, by those other Scots who were already in service from the 1610s or the 1620s, Thomas Cunningham, John Cunningham, and Patrick Dunbar. There's quite a lot of Scots in the Norwegian army. But let's go back to that 30,000 Scots in Swedish service. When the war actually kicks off, when Hannibal actually gets to Gothenburg and blockades it by sea and blockades it by land, who's resisting? And this is how the Proxy War pans out. Defending Gothenburg from the Norwegian Scots, Colonel William Philip, Colonel Hugo Hamilton, Colonel John Gordon, plus 8 Scottish admirals and captains at sea, most importantly, one Admiral Simon Stewart from Orkney. Against them, we have Andrew Seaton from the Bohus Marines, Colonel James Murray, Bergen House Infantry by land, and Colonel John Taylor also by land. So the question is, how does this leave Scottish-Danish relations when we have a war fought by regiments commanded by Scots on both sides? Simple answer is, not a lot. 37 Scottish burgesses lived in Bergen alone during the 44-45 period. Thomas Cunningham was appointed governor of Altmark by his uncle Thomas, and John by his uncle John, and John is still Lensman of Finnmark with his community of Scots operating up there. From a Norwegian, from a Danish, from a Swedish perspective, the Scottish involvement is irrelevant. Nevertheless, if you're one of the Scots, whether it be royalist or long-term Danish-Norwegian resident, or if you're one of the Scots who's been in service since 1628, this is obviously great, of huge importance. But the conflict fought on Norwegian and Swedish soil by Scottish-led regiments does not impact in any shape or form on relations between Scotland and Sweden or Scotland and Denmark-Norway. A war which did have slightly more direct consequences in the civilian population is the Second Anglo-Dutch War. An odd name when you think about it. In my book, Terror of the Seas, I called it the First Scotto-Dutch War, which is what it was. And despite originally going to be on the side of Charles II, the Danes managed to find themselves on the side of the Dutch, which allowed Scottish privateers to take certain liberties. Captain Thomas Bennett sailed with a small privateering fleet into Nedstrand, where he set fire to the town. He took about 60 hostages, including 4 councillors. He stripped the ships in the harbour of their cannon, which means his ships must have actually been docked on the shore. He also made off with an amount of money estimated variously at, numbers that are so ludicrous it cannot be true, but $50,000 has been suggested by some people. When I was researching the Nedstrand Raid, I got this excellent letter from archivists and museum assistants, Dagfinn Siljard and Sigmar Mura, where they said, we've taken care of the house that was used for customs clearance after the Scottish attack in 1666. A house was built in Nedstrand in 1550, which will be part of our local museum. So if you should come across the customs chest with 3 locks in it, we would like to have it back for the museum, even if the money is gone, as if the Scots would have kept the money. That is not a picture of the actual chest, but I just put it there for value, and I did wind up our Norwegian friends saying I think I might have found it. But nevertheless, the Nedstrand Raid is important because this is a direct raid on Norwegian civilian population. This was not a raid against the Norwegian military. It caused repercussions in the sense that people wanted to get revenge. They didn't know how. And part of the reason the reason they didn't know how was because Bennett, as he left, intimated that the entire Royal Navy were coming with 10,000 soldiers to come and land in Norway. It was a complete fabrication, and it was designed to move Danish Norwegian assets from the Danish Sound and away so that the English fleet could get into the Baltic, and it worked. There was one other consequence of the raid, which is worth noting. 6 Scottish sailors jumped ship from a Norwegian warship, stole a ship, and spent a good several months raiding the Norwegian coast, probably doing more damage in total than the Nedstrand Raid did in 2 days. However, they were captured by the captain of the very ship they deserted, and I cannot find out what happened to them, although I suspect we all know the answer to that. So again, we return to the issue of what happened when we had a direct strike against Norway coming from Scots. By the way, from a Norwegian perspective, the Scottish raid was piracy. From the Scottish perspective, it's privateering. That's not just semantics. I would actually come down on the side of privateering. That's got nothing to do with the fact that they were Scots, because they carried a letter of marque. But during the time, we find that Scottish communities in Norway continue to thrive. Sir William Davidson is a very interesting character. He was the conservator there. He was also the English ambassador to Middelburg, based in Middelburg. But during the Anglo-Dutch War, or the first Scoto-Dutch War, he has to leave the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic. So he goes to Norway, a country that is also at war with the home kingdoms. And there he builds up. He's already an investor in Mudstadmark ironwork outside Trondheim, but now he settles his community there. He moves in managers, he moves in some families there. He also owns, by the way, the Royal Danish salt monopoly. And I'm kind of impressed about the brashness of this guy. Davidson owns Mudstadmark. He trades timber to Scotland during the war. He also trades to the Dutch Republic and the Caribbean on Dutch ships at a moment when no Scot is even allowed to trade in the Caribbean because of the English Navigation Acts, on ships of an enemy nation, trading goods of another enemy nation, and Charles II gives him the paperwork he needs to do it. And that's where we decide or see that money talks. He's not the only one operating out of Norway during this time of conflict. Job Jacobson Dishington, who was ethnically Orcadian, continued to trade between Bergen and Orkney throughout the war. Bergen and Leith ships just carried on trading timber as if nothing was happening. Scots like Colonel James Hamilton and Major John Forbes in Norwegian Army served without any question about their nationality or loyalty to the crown that they served. There is no such thing as total war in this era. And I think what we're seeing with every conflict we're looking at, that ultimately the commercial sphere remains more or less untouched unless you're one of the victims of privateering and your ship is impounded. That's a different story, and somebody should write a book about it. So how does all this kind of wrap up? Well, I've got a bee in my bonnet about this type of scholarship. A Northern Commonwealth by Gordon Donaldson goes straight from 1612 to the 20th century without any detailed study of the timber trade or any discussion of the conflicts that went on between Scotland and Norway. There were more other than the ones I've just mentioned. There was one in the 1520s, the Bergen incident, which Nina Mosby Pedersen wrote about. In the war of the 1670s, there's more direct Scottish-Norwegian conflict. I chose 3 as exemplars. But see this other book, Sweden and Britain, 1,000 Years of Friendship. This kind of scholarship tries to build up a special case for a relationship between this place and that. And it's a false way of looking at things. Sometimes there's periods of good trade and commerce. Other times there's periods of conflict. Sometimes there is indeed, much later, total war. Now, what I like about the new generation of scholars is that people are now looking at these things with a more sophisticated eye and finding out not that there's something like if you take Alexia's book, An Unofficial Alliance, the last chapter there is about the way Sweden dropped Scotland like a hot potato and adopted the Cromwellian Republic. Captain Zickerman's book also looks at, now I know that says German Sea and it's the wider Elvesa region, but it's partly Danish owned, partly Swedish owned, but also looks at conflict. Thomas Rees does the same thing in Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? And nor should we forget that the Scots are only trading with Scandinavia. That's why I've included Caledonian Connection, the Scottish-Russian ties, and The Great Immigration, a fabulous book about Scots moving into Krakow and the small duchy of Little Poland. It's actually a very large duchy of Little Poland. To try and get us to remember that we have to look at any migration, whether it's from Scotland to Norway or Scotland to Sweden, in the wider context. We have to know where everybody else is. And that's one of the things where I think the database has served us well. And while looking and testing the idea of conflict between nations at times of supposed friendship is something that we should do more often. And if we think of Scotland's greatest and longest standing ally, France, just remember that Scotland went to war with France 4 times in the 17th century, but if you read books about the Entente Cordiale, it's hardly mentioned. I think I've probably made all the points that I would like to make, but just to re-emphasize the last one, that although there's episodic conflict between Scotland and Norway, and indeed Scotland and the Netherlands, what we actually find is that economic factors in the 17th century overrode this just about every time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Steve. We've already got lots of questions coming in. I'll just get those up in a second.
You want to do stop share?
It's up to yourself. You can leave that on, or you can close it down.
Stop share. Yeah, let's have a look at people.
So we're just getting questions through on the chat just now. So I'll just read these out, and I'll just remind everyone that if you do have questions, please do just type them into the chat bar on the right hand side of your screens, and make sure that you're putting it to all panelists so we can all see them. So the first question we've got is from Thomas. Thomas asks, are there connections to the province of Bohuslän? When you look at history writing in the early 18th century, Scots are mentioned as raiding in the 7th and 8th centuries. Many legends tell of this. They're written down, as you see, much later, and I wonder about the connection.
I think with Bohuslän, it's the same as any other part of Norway. It doesn't have the same massive concentration that we have in the larger cities, but you see the Seaton, I think it was in charge of the Marines based in Bohuslän. One of the problems for the database that we've got is we can show you where the big cities are and where the big settlements are. It will take us forever to go around and do every smaller settlement. So, for example, I know because of Nina's work that in the 1660s and 1670s, a new Scottish community springs up in Molde in Norway, and I know nothing about it. I can't put a single name to it. I've never been there. Nina's always promised me, that's for 20 years, by the way, that one day she'll go and get me the records and I can put them into the database. I'm waiting. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, we've got a question from Lindsey Cameron. What are the respective populations of Sweden and Denmark, Norway in 1589, if you know them?
Sweden would be just shy of 1 million. I actually don't know the population of Denmark, Norway. Interesting. No, I would imagine it would be less densely populated, but that's just an estimation. And part of the problems with Sweden is you're skewed. Remember, the biggest Swedish city isn't in Sweden. It is in Sweden in the grander scheme of things. It's Riga is the biggest Swedish city. So yeah, quite how that all shapes up to the Danish Norwegian population, I will write it down and I will go and do my homework.
There you go.
Thank you for pointing out the huge gap in my knowledge.
That's what we're here for. That's what the best questions are for. Excellent. I would just oh, there's some supplies coming in. Some more question juice. We've got another question coming in. We've actually got a few questions that have just come in there. From Leslie Mackay, Superb talk, Steve. Has there been a DNA study for Scots migration through Scandinavia?
Yes, there has. There have been several. And I get one of the things, the SSNE database is a research tool for academics. And when we see the analytics every week, it is genealogists one after the other. So I know about loads of DNA studies. There's a huge problem with the study. A lot of the earlier studies used to say the Vikings came and enslaved Picts and Strathclyde Britons and took them all over, but that's before they knew quite the extent of the Scottish migration in the 17th and 18th century, 16th and 17th centuries. And I do have a lot of time for a lot of the DNA stuff that's being done now because it's much more subtle, trying to pin out, when did all this happen. Now, I don't have a personal interest in genealogy as such, so I can't, at my fingertips, tell you this or that about where to go for your DNA service, but I know there's several have been done, or more than several, there's been lots of them done.
It's really an explosive area just now. There's just loads being done on DNA, which is insane when you think. I think the first full ancient DNA sample was fully sequenced was 2010 or something like. Someone can correct me there, but in crazy progress in that time. We've got a question from Anus. The SSNE database captures the more prominent Scots migrants. Might there be a way of expanding this to capture more information about the fates and prospects of humbler migrants?
Yeah, that's a fair question, Anus. What we do is wherever they turn up, whatever record base, whether it's baptismal records, church records, we put them in, regardless. Where we get, I said earlier on, we don't look at common soldiers unless they turn up in the court records, unless they've been naughty. And there's two main court records for that. There's the city court records, and there's also the consistory. And the consistory is an absolute riot. And that we do get a lot of the other lads in. They're going in there now. I think if you were to go to the database and in the text box, type in the word consistory spelt with a K, you'll get about 12 or 13 examples, including one young boy who's done for witchcraft 4 times. He keeps turning up with books of spells, but he's too young to fling in the fire, so they don't. Other cases where my favourite one, in fact, is Scottish common soldier who's just basically instructed at the point of a gun to marry his bride in.
That'll do it.
And and it's in Scots as well. It's brilliant. He's just like, yeah, fine, okay, Matt, I'll do it. So yeah, we're trying to. The problem there is, like the problem with women, where are the records? We've tried to scan wherever there's online databases, we try to plug them in. The database is getting expanded all the time. There's one of my former PhD students, Jack Abernethy, I don't know if Jack's here tonight, but Jack has pumped in about 800 people from the Dutch Republic, but Dutch who are connecting, coming in through the Netherlands and then up to Scandinavia in record sources I wouldn't see. The problem is we're never going to be able to do something as consistently as we can with muster rolls, baptismal records, burial records. And it's the consistency of the record base that's the problem.
Is that just a case of going into something like a data collection like the consistory courts and just kind of deep mining it and just someone having the time to go through that massive data?
And of course, when we started this, my thesis was on diplomatic relations.
Yeah.
And Alexia's was more on, because there wasn't firm diplomatic relations, more on the military ennoblement side of things. But over the years, every time we go back to Scandinavia, I'm away tomorrow, I'll be in the archive on Monday and I'll find another record set and I'll pump in whatever I find. And I don't care if they're Scottish, English, Irish, whatever information I get in that seam, it goes in. And that's the way that you build up an actual balanced picture of what the migration looks like. And it's also one of the reasons that we didn't do things like skippers of ships. I mean, you could go through the port books and find every time a ship from Leith arrives in Bergen. But if they're only there to drop off, their salt or their hides or their fish, and then they're coming back with timber, what purpose does that do for a migration database?
Yeah. You're not getting a kind of full picture then. Just a reminder, folks, send your questions into the chat box and make sure that you're sending them to all panelists rather than using the Q&A function. So we're just checking the chat box. If you're putting in the Q&A, can you fire them over to the chat? But we've got loads of comments and questions coming in. Lots of thanks to you, Steve, for giving the paper. The next question is from Alison Clark. I'm interested to hear more about the lack of affinity individuals had to nationality. So going back to your motivations point.
Yeah, the motivations point is that lack of affinity. Very often, these people put in a caveat, and that caveat is even James Spence. James Spence, I said, was Axel Oxenstierna's Chancellor of Sweden's spy master. He absolutely wrecks a Polish plan to invade Sweden by getting his spies in. But when he's cultivated and co-opted as a spy master, he makes the Swedes write a contract where they will never ask him to do anything against his dread sovereign. So he is a nobleman in Sweden. He is a member of the inner circle, the state council, but he is always going to be loyal to his dread sovereign. And that's usual. Where we have a record for it, but how many people do we have a record of it? So I can tell you probably 100 people who take oaths or some such that they will never fight against their dread sovereign. But we've got 8,500 people we're dealing with.
Yes.
So are these people standing out because they make such an oath, or are they representative? Are officers going to be of the same ilk as the soldiers?
Yeah.
It's very hard.
That's the side of militaristic that in this period that we just know so little about, the actual administration of these oaths and who takes the oaths, because like you say, we only get tiny fractions of what's going on and how these things are actually done on the ground. We've got a question from Adam Grimshaw. Great chat, Prof. Can you tell us any more about what happened to the likes of Cunningham in Finnmark and Davidson's involvement in Mostadsmark? Apologies if I've mispronounced that. Did money ever make it back to Scotland, or did it ever encourage more Scots to come over to Norway? I seem to remember a certain Englishman who was in charge of the customs of Norway getting done for embezzlement and getting packed off to England and banished from the kingdoms.
That would be Anthony Knipe, and he knows Anthony Knipe very well. He did his dissertation on Anthony Knipe. He's not fooling me. Yes, there is a strong tradition of repatriation of capital. John Cunningham dies either in Finnmark or Bergen. He never comes home. But many of them did. Many of them, the intention was to come home. So there's a difference between the way Scottish traders and English traders work. If you're going out as an English trader to Scandinavia or the Baltic, you're looking at a 4 or 5 year stint, usually. Particularly if you're in one of the monopoly companies, Eastland Company, Merchant Adventurers, some such. Scots tend to go out there for about 30 odd years with the intention of coming home, but it's too late. They've already married their Norwegian girlfriend and they've got a family and they're now Norwegians. Do they remit capital home? Absolutely. And the way we look at that is looking at wills and testaments. And we've actually been able to do that one down to the level of common soldier, because not for Scandinavia, but for the Netherlands, because the Dutch notarial records are second to none. And when we did a survey of 150 Scottish wills and testaments by common soldiers versus 150 English testaments, we found the Scots were usually remitting everything they had. The English seldom remitted anything. People of the same rank, they were spending it. So how were the Scots then living if they were remitting everything home? Who knows? But there's certainly an idea that when you move abroad, you're going abroad to try to enhance your family. And there's also a kind of people accept that they're probably going to die abroad. So they knowing that, they very often ship their wealth back and make provision to have their wealth shipped back, if not immediately, but soon after. So, for example, we've got people who start off as common soldiers, leaving money for scholarships at universities. St Andrews has got it, the city of Perth has got it, where common soldiers have served out there, they've died out there. But yet in their will, they're making sure that, my favourite one, which I tried to claim for somebody at St Andrews, was a guy called Lindsey, Harry Lindsey, and he remitted money back just before he died, for anyone, any pauper of the name of Lindsey to go to St Andrews University. So I was trying to get this, but apparently that loophole was closed, but very recently, like in the last 15 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was gunning for it. I thought if I can find one.
I was going to say, I would let that fly just for the pure audacity, I think. We've got another question from Lindsey saying, I was wondering if the difference in Scots migration to the countries related to their relative populations. So I think that's in reference to comparisons with Ireland and Wales.
I think it's got a lot to do. I'm going to say something very controversial, and I don't know if there's any Danes or Norwegians in tonight, but let's put it this way. The Swedes will probably take more offence. Sweden is El Dorado. Sweden is underpopulated. It's massive, given its width and its length. It has massacred its own nobility twice. Well, Christian II, Christian Tyrann, massacred the Swedish nobility in the Stockholm bloodbath in the 1520s. Then the Swedes had their own second bloodbath in the 1590s. If you did well in Sweden and you lived, the chances are that you would get some kind of position out of it. So we're looking at something like 80 Scottish families ennobled in a 30-year period in Sweden. And that 80 individuals being ennobled then very quickly means there's several hundred Scottish nobles in Scandinavia. Same in the army. Even if you don't get ennobled, you might get a commandantship. The Swedish Empire is expanding and growing. Whereas if you compare that to Denmark, Norway, you can get in as a Burgess merchant because you have a skill and because you have a trade. But you look at that, think back to that table, how few people became parliamentarians, councillors, or any kind of high status. It's because Denmark, Norway is a full society. No Danish nobleman's going to give up his castle. There hasn't been that bloodbath. Denmark's a tiny country. It's only a large realm because of Norway and because of the Iceland, etc., etc. But it's a full society in the sense of your chances of getting into the Danish nobility are limited. I think 5 Scots get in this period, of which all of it do by marriage, as opposed to getting it in their own right. The exception there being John Cunningham.
That's very interesting. We've got a question from Alex Green. How would you characterise the legacy of Norway-Scotland's relationship, and what levels, if any, is there of consciousness or awareness that remain today?
Could you repeat that just a second, please?
Oh, sorry, I've misread it as well, which probably doesn't help matters. I'll scroll back down to it. How would you characterise the legacy of Norway-Scotland's relationship? What levels, if any, is there of consciousness or awareness that remain within Norwegians on the subject?
I think it's more prevalent in Sweden than it is in Norway. I think most Norwegians would know about Sinklars Vise, the poem, the epic Storm's poem. They would know about Edvard Grieg from the later period. But in terms of, and especially if you go to Rosendal barony, then they're very aware of it there. But in terms of actual consciousness of these older standing things, you're much more likely to bump into somebody in Sweden who will know it, largely because of so many Swedes carrying Scottish names. I mean, the Swedish James Bond is called Hamilton. I mean, how did that happen? And that's just my experience of being there. You'll get people who study this very closely, like the late Sylvie Sugner knew it very well, knew it inside out. Nina Osby Pedersen knows it inside out. But in terms of the numbers, just the sheer number of people that understand the Scottish relationship from a Swedish perspective is better known there. And I'll put that in context. I picked up a long time ago a school textbook on Gustav Adolf's campaigns, and the number of Scots who were listed in short biographies at the back. The Swedes knew more about the Scots in Swedish service in the 30 Years' War than Scots do.
Yeah,
long way. But like I say, there's individuals you couldn't go to Finnmark and not know about John Cunningham. But in terms of that actual long-standing legacy, I think it's more recent. And it tends to be people fishing back, looking for a moment. And Edvard Grieg, of course, is the one who people really cling on to.
we've loads of questions coming in. I'll try and get through them before we have to close up. But the next one is from Edward Shattock. Were there more Scottish shipbuilders in Sweden or Denmark, Norway in the late 16th century?
Were there more shipbuilders in
Sweden or Denmark, Norway?
I think in Sweden off the top of my head.
Oh.
Although I think David Balfour's legacy is in Denmark, Norway is probably of higher profile than, well, Edward and I were both at a talk last night where we heard about the Clark family in Sweden, but that's a tough one. Martin Bellamy, who did his PhD on Scottish shipbuilders in Sweden, he would argue it was Denmark, Norway, of course, but but I think just sheer statistics from the database, I think it's in Sweden.
That's interesting. My gut would have said Denmark, Norway, so it shows how much I know. Our next question is from Stefan Brink. Were Scots migrating to, for example, Sweden, settling in towns or in the countryside and becoming farmers? Thank you very much for the talk.
Hi Stefan, been a long time. I think that's a very interesting one. You get this idea of we've got a lot of Scottish soldiers coming back from the wars, private soldiers, corporals, lower rankers, who are getting to go and rest up in their soldiers' hut in the country and see out their days. We've got quite a few of those. There was a very good article by two genealogists on the Scots and Sigtuna. If you go to the Northern Studies website, I think you're able to download it from there, but it's the Scots and Sigtuna, and using Sigtuna as a kind of retirement village. People from Sigtuna wouldn't like me calling Sigtuna a village, but it's compared to the metropole, it's the ex-capital of Sweden. But yes, you are getting them going to the country. Where we can actually trace where people are getting land is the widows. Catherine Zickerman and I did an analysis of the widows, and what we're finding is that very often they're getting numbers of farms, 15, 25 farms, in places quite close to the metropolis, round about the Mälaren, so on the big lake that goes just to the west of Stockholm. And we're finding quite a few of the widows are getting big farms, and on there we're very often finding old retired soldiers.
Wow. I guess that's the other side of the wealth, right? It's the wealth and land that some of these people are getting.
Well, that's the thing, because very often what the widows are asking for initially is, could I get my husband's back pay?
Yeah.
And they very often say, we can't afford it. Sweden's bust.
Yeah.
We don't have money. Here, have a chunk of, Västernorrland. Have a big lump of, have it. And there's a great one. She's one of my favorite. I think it's Isabel Spence. It's Isabel Spence, where basically she writes in 1638. She's married to a major general called James Ramsay, and she says, give me my husband's back pay. And they say, well, you would get it if you lived in Sweden. So she up sticks from St Andrews without knowing a word of Swedish, goes there and farms for the next 25 years. And they say to her, you can't keep it if you marry again. So she stays single. Hey, she's got a few housemen round about the place, but
What a hero. What a hero.
She's a legend.
I guess that's why Alexander Leslie chooses to get paid in muskets and cannon.
You're not joking.
No, I'm not. We've got a question here from Sally Garden. Thanks, Steve, for a wonderful talk. Is there any evidence whether the 2,500 Scots soldiers who crossed to Sweden after Stodengrip met with further resistance going through Norway?
Absolutely none. They went through. It was they were shipped in by the Dutch actually, and they were dropped off just outside Trondheim. They actually thought about taking Trondheim. Now it depends on the source you read. I've seen a secondary source where it says they sieged Trondheim, but I think they were more keen just to get into Sweden and get the job done. They joined about another 2,000 Scottish soldiers who were there and went down, and that was a core of Spence's army. But no, there was no further resistance. And I think that's why there's no song. It's thing when you're winning, you know what I mean? It's probably the greatest case study ever.
Sieges are decisively less sexy as well. They don't tend to get as many songs. We've got another question from Liston Kai. Does Sweden acknowledge the number of Scots in high office and their influence? I guess that's been covered somewhat, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Super. I think finally at the bottom of this list. There is time if anyone has got any last questions. I might abuse my position to ask a cheeky one myself. What does Denmark-Norway do in terms of its attitude towards Scotland during the Cromwellian period? Because obviously Denmark-Norway is very prominent in supporting exiled royalists after the Civil War. Denmark-Norway is very involved in supporting things like Montrose's attempted rising in 4950. See, I told you I'd work them in somehow. Is there any kind of change in relations between Denmark-Norway and the Cromwellian authorities, or is it much the same, that in terms of money and business, everything just keeps going as it has?
No, there's a marked change there. When Denmark-Norway, so Frederick III starts to seize Scottish shipping, because of course any Scottish ship at sea is flying the flag of the Cromwellian Commonwealth if it wants to trade. So the Scots who go across and become inside Baltic traders, they're still flying the saltire. But if you're a Scottish merchant, you want to come back into your Scottish port, you're flying the flag of the Commonwealth. And when Denmark seizes Scottish ships because they're flying the Commonwealth flag, and Denmark's at war with Sweden, Cromwell goes for the Danes and basically says, "Give me my Scots back," or basically, here comes Warwick's navy. Deal with it. So no, and I think it's very problematic when you're talking about the usurpation or the interregnum. Take your pick of vocabulary. I'm not bothered, because people get inflamed about it. But for the majority of the Scottish population after 1651, they are part of the Commonwealth, and that's it. And what's their options? You can resist, like Glencairn and Middleton, and run around the Highlands until you're stripped naked and etc., or you can just get on with business. I'm not saying they liked it, but they did it. And yes, Denmark takes a very negative stance towards Scottish traders because they're part of Cromwell's regime, and Cromwell is in cahoots with Carl X, beg your pardon, Carl X.
See, guilty by association then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's us at the bottom of the questions, and unless anyone's got a last minute one that they're going to throw in, we will finish exactly on time actually, which is nice. Just lots of thanks coming into you, Steve, for the talk.
I think that last one's from Helen Lowe. That doesn't count. She's my neighbour. Thank you, Helen.
Well, my neighbours wouldn't watch me talk, so. But if there's no more questions, what I'll do is I'll just bring everything to a close. Yeah, just lots of thanks coming in there. So the only thing that I've got left to do is I'd like to ask everyone to virtually give the thanks for Steve for a fantastic talk and a fantastic discussion afterwards. So a very awkward round of applause for Steve, but it's just me clapping. But thank you very much, Steve. The only thing that's left for me to do just now is to warmly invite everyone to the next talk in our winter seminar series, which will be at the same time next month, so the final Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock, when we'll be joined by Dr. Alison Cathcart, who will be given a paper entitled "They Offered to Give Me What They Do Not Even Hope to Gain: Ireland, Orkney and Shetland and Kingship in the Reign of James V," which will undoubtedly be fantastic, and I'm sure many of the people in attendance tonight will definitely be there next month. But until then, all that's left for me to do now is to wish everyone a lovely evening, and thank you all for coming along, and thank you again, Steve, for the paper.
No bother. Pleasure. Thanks for the invite. Go again soon.